Welcome, everybody. So you'll see by the title that it says Tuesdays with Teresa. And when I realized that I missed Tuesday and joining you with a little bit of insight from Teresa of Avila, I wondered, well, should I just skip this week? And I thought, why skip it? There's too much juiciness in what Teresa of Avila has to offer us to go without an extra week. And I figured that if she has any play in this, that she wouldn't mind at all if I had Tuesdays with Teresa on Thursdays. And I play upon as well this idea that it's all timeless anyway, right? There's a part of us and our life that is timeless. So in a way, if we wanted to, we could conjure up the notion that Thursday actually holds Tuesday within it. So there you have my own playfulness. Now the topic today is one that is incredibly close to the heart of Teresa of Avila, and that is the notion of friendship. If you read any of her works, if you investigate any of her writings, if you learn about her life, you will find that from the youngest age, friendship is hugely important to her. Part of her makeup, I think part of it is that she's so strongly feminine in nature, that relational quality about being here in life is foundational to her happiness. And as you probably know, when you can identify something as being really important in your life as a line of continuity, it's usually the place where you're learning your growth and your lessons as well. And it is so for Teresa in regards to friendship. In fact, I'll even lay out the story when she was a young child and there was a lot of reformation and change happening in the Christian culture. Catholicism was birthing new explorations with Luther and Calvin and Anabaptist, and there were all sorts of things happening that today we recognize as unique paths with a similar focus. Back then, it felt like things were being broken apart, that things were ending and things were in division. And in her heartfelt response to that, she wanted to be a martyr. And she runs away to be a martyr, but do you know she runs away with her brother? So it's a little bit of an insight into how important friendship will be in her life. And while it's life-giving for her to be in community, it's also the place where she experiences her own fears of being alone, fears of losing her path. And again, I'm going to use her language, her relationship with God. Fear of losing God in her life is huge. So friendship gives a way of reinforcing that ultimately she's not alone in life, and it teaches her about herself and friending herself, which is something that we'll get to. Now, when she was young and she joined the monastery, she has a funny story to share with us, and if you follow me in any way, shape, or form in her life, you'll find that I'll return to this because I think it's a great example. So she was deeply spiritual by nature, and she was very charismatic. She's one of these people, if you can think of someone in your mind that people are just drawn to. Her charisma was attractive. She was very approachable. She was very matter-of-fact, and she was very fiery. So while she was really grounded, she also loved the celebration of the human spirit. She had that wonderful complementariness in her character. So people loved to talk with her. People loved to be close to her, just like she loved to be with people. So she joins a monastery that has hundreds of individuals as a part of it. And monastic life had been doing quite a dance with being very much a part of society and culture's way of being in community, while it was at the same time seeking out a more existential goal for why it existed. So in her particular monastery, the Incarnation, there were hundreds of women, and they observed the caste system even inside the monastery, but let's save that for another time. She recounts that she was so nervous and fearful about being alone in silence that she would book lots of time to be in the speak room where she could talk about spiritual things with visitors. So she now had this status of being a nun and being someone that represented something about the relationship to God and spirituality. And she let that be her ticket to avoid silence instead of her ticket to go deeper in silence. And she was great about talking about spirituality. Well, 20 years later, she has the first deep, all-consuming shake-up experiences of God in the person of Jesus, that her relationship with silence changes. There's a natural experience of love and abundance that wells up so much within her that she didn't need to say no to something she was still attracted to. She wanted to say yes to something that allured her even more. Her friendship with God and with the divine had taken on a new phase in her life. And in her autobiography, which is the first version of what we have in the more sophisticated, seasoned version in the Interior Castle, which many of you probably know. So in this first version, written very early on, she accounts as to how she starts being personally desiring to live simplicity. And the rule for a religious order is the precepts and the ordinances and the articulations of what the spirit of what you're doing is about. The rule and the constitutions, which is the way you live it out day to day. She found that the rule she was living and the constitution she was living was not aligned with the same simplicity as when Carmelite order was founded back in 1200s. In fact, it was, I think, 1216 or 1219 when Albert of Jerusalem, a bishop, approved the rule of the Carmelites living as hermits on Mount Carmel. She wanted to live that rule. And isn't that the case in everyone that has a calling in life that has to do with reforming? They have the personal experience first that sets the desire on fire. And then when they stay faithful to that desire, it leads them usually to changing, either to changing their own lifestyle or to changing something about where they are, what society is doing, or what the structure is. True advocacy for some high good. Perhaps you can even recount a story in your own life when you were so inspired that the following of that inspiration led you on a new trajectory, not a turning away from, but a furtherance on the path that's at the heart of why we're here. So she longed to live in community life that would let her go deep within the rule. And in that, she began a tension that she says exists for 28 years of what it meant to have friendship with others in this life. She loved friendship. She loved women. She loved men too. And she had hundreds, if not thousands, of friends. But she had, in the beginning of this experience of new union with God, a certain tension between what it meant to be in friendship with others and what it meant to be in friendship with God. That tension led her to a new appreciation of her friendships. So she is not of the school, and if you read her writings, you might think that she has a turning away from all friendships as part of her response to union with God. And she's not of that school. She's totally of the school that friendships in this life are meant to be part of the path, that we're meant to be in community. But sifting through the choices that we make of the friendships in our life is integral to being faithful to our path. Does that make sense? So where there could be tension in saying, okay, being faithful to the unitive experiences, to the solitary nature of the journey, to the mystical callings and pinings that we may have, to the relationship with God, that being faithful to that may seem that we need to abandon the very friendship desire within us. And she is saying, nope. She's calling us to greater maturity. She's saying, no, we're not meant to be without friends. We're meant to be without the desires for friendships and the acting on those desires that are not life-giving. And the willingness to separate ourselves out from acting on desires that are only going to diminish our spirit, to be detached not from the world, but from the contracts we make in the world, just so we can stroke ourselves with a false sense of comfort. Well, when she started to long for a community, she realized that it wasn't going to happen in the huge monastery of the Incarnation for her, that the setup just wasn't inherent, and it began to plant a real niggling of longing to start a community that she says, I long to have a small group of friends where we're committed to friendship with God together. And the rule of Carmel, which interestingly, if you read the rule, it's one of the shortest rules in the various charismatic Catholic orders. It's 18 chapters, and each chapter is anywhere between 1 and 3 sentences long. So the rule is literally about 2 small pages, or maybe even 1 page that's 8.5 by 11. I love the Carmelite rule, and perhaps someday we can go deeper into that. She wants the rule to be her guide. And so she starts posing the question, who would want to join me in starting a monastery? Does anybody else have the longing to have a smaller community where we can be closer and where we can spend more time in true solitude and true communion and true teaching, where chant and meditation and prayer and the simplicity of living in community can be the factors that bind us together, where we can let go of the ways society is influencing us? Well, she largely met with opposition. If you read in her autobiography, she says, I was very much disliked throughout my monastery because I wanted to found a more enclosed monastery. Isn't it interesting? She has this radical change of longing to be in the speak room to maybe not even wanting to have a speak room. They said I was insulting them, that in my own monastery I could also serve God since there were others in it better than I. So they were playing upon the hierarchy that there had been many people living in that monastery in the Incarnation that had much more experience, that were reputed to be much more spiritual. They tried to put a little guilt trip on her. They said, and it was probably sincere, the grief could be sincerely moving them to think that. She was told that she had no love for the house, that it would be better to procure income for this house, the Incarnation, than for some other. Several of her own sisters said she should be thrown into a prison cell, and others, very few, lightly defended. Wow. So she says, I saw clearly that in many matters my opponents were right, and sometimes I gave them explanations. Yet since I couldn't mention the main factor, which was that she felt impelled, she experienced a call from God to do it, she couldn't really explain that because nobody would believe her. She was young, she was inexperienced, and of course, they didn't want to lose her. How often when we have a genuine, authentic experience that those around us fail to understand. These are the moments of courage. Not courage that we're meant to be alone, but courage to notice that in that moment, in order to be faithful to our path, we need to stand alone. that standing alone will allow us to open the door to the life-giving friendships that we're meant to have. Well, because of her charisma and the stars aligning, if you will, she was able to found that first monastery, St. Joseph's, right in Avila, in her town. And she has 3 matters that are of great importance to her that she writes about in a book that her sisters in St. Joseph asked her to write. It's called The Way of Perfection. She wrote it just to speak about how they could live in community together, to speak about the nature of prayer, to speak about many of the ecstatic states, and even the prayer of quiet, the stillness to which she felt everyone was called, to explain what it meant to live in community around searching these experiences. And she notes 3 important themes that she thinks are foundational to living in community. Now, in her life, she didn't want any of her communities to be more than 13 nuns. Think of going from hundreds to 13. This doesn't mean she's learned everything she has to about the nature of friendship. We'll get into that more later. She puts this out there. She says, I shall enlarge on only 3 things which are from our own ruling constitutions and which are important to understand, to practice inwardly and outwardly if we are going to come to the place where we experience the peace that goes beyond all understanding. The first is love for one another. The second is detachment from all created things. And the third is true humility, which, even though I speak of it last, Teresa says, is the main practice and embraces all the others. Now, she's so playful. She says, now speaking of love for one another, it is most important, for there is nothing more annoying that is not suffered easily by those who love one another. Think about when you truly feel love, even if it's as superficial as infatuation. That person can do things that don't grate upon you at all because you're in the flow of that love. And someone else who you don't feel the same intimacy with, they can do the exact same thing that's maybe not even really offensive. Maybe it's just a quirk and it could grate on your nerves. So her love for one another is to get so in touch with being in love as a state of being that it spills over to those around us. Now, it sounds like a paradox, doesn't it, that her second theme is detachment from all created things. And that's where the sword of discernment comes in. And discernment is gained through true humility. I would say that for me, true humility is drawing close to self. As Teresa was moving through her life, she went in and out of emotions in relation to friendships, of losing friends, of gaining friends, of longing for friendship, of fear of being alone. And I think it was her raw mystical experiences that brought her to a place of humility. Humility is the obedience to the truth as it arises from within your own heart, within your own soul. It is not a self-effacing, self-deprecating stance where we view everything around us as better. Humility dissolves the hierarchy. It does away with the playing field. It lets you and I be completely vulnerable to the inspiration of the moment. And in that vulnerability, we come face to face, not necessarily with another, but with ourselves. And we come face to face with our motives. And when we come face to face with our motives, we can see, am I reaching and grasping for connection with the created thing so that I don't need to be alone? Or am I loving freely because my cup is already full? She is all about the cup being full. Detachment in her mind is not bereftness and going without. It is coming to the banquet so that there's an overflowing. So I leave you with this as I continue to navigate. How do you choose your friendships? Do you let yourself draw close to what is truly your cup being filled, and let your love overflow without distinction to every human being and every created thing? Because if you do that, the friendships you're meant to have, they'll shine before you. They'll not only mirror the love that is overflowing, but there'll be a particular resonance. It's not simply being so detached that we don't have a connection between I and thou. It's being so free that the I and the thou become a dance where we celebrate in comfortable and uncomfortable ways love coming into form, new life coming into form, word being made flesh in our very being. You are anointed for this journey. So thank you for joining me for Tuesdays with Teresa on Thursdays. May this inspiration from her give you courage on your own path of friendship. And I am so grateful that we are friends. Blessings. Bye.